Okay, got it. All right, well, welcome everybody to this 2023 annual conference on reducing the threat of nuclear war and with a focus on the social and economic cost of the weapons buildup. Everybody here knows we are living in perilous times. The danger of a nuclear exchange is increasing. Democratic processes are under attack at home and abroad, and our nation's wealth is being squandered on dangerous and unnecessary weapons and war preparation, with more than half the congressional discretionary budget devoted to military ends. Sadly, few Americans know that half of the income taxes they send to the federal government are diverted to the military-industrial complex. Thus, the fact that the lack of housing and the inadequate response to the pandemic, inadequate health care, is in part due to this diversion, is invisible to them. At least that's the case in Massachusetts. I go around giving talks on this stuff. People are always astonished when I report how much of their tax dollars go to the military. So one goal of today's conference is to render more visible the ways in which the bloated weapons budget undermines the civilian economy. Many of us believe that this connection is key to Americans becoming more active in opposing nuclear and conventional weapons buildup. And to this end, we have brought together a number of leaders of important national constituencies: National Nurses United, the Board People's Campaign, the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, to join in this discussion. Now, a few words. This is no longer quote an MIT conference; it's now a national conference. But a few words on the MIT origins of this conference. When the Manhattan Project wound down, one group of physicists relocated to MIT, others to Berkeley and others to Chicago. The ones who came to MIT were the group that thought it was a mistake to drop the bomb on Japan. And these physicists established an informal program on nuclear disarmament, and MIT emerged as one of the national centers of advocacy for nuclear disarmament, even at the time when we were a major Pentagon contractor for conventional weapons. Among them were Philip Morrison, who with postdoctoral fellow Randy Forsberg, Katsipis, later Aaron Bernstein, first formulated the nuclear weapons freeze campaign. People are sometimes astonished to hear that the origin of that was that MIT group. Of course, it's only 2 days ago that we celebrated the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., who most forcibly brought to the American people the clear message that the bombs dropped in Vietnam also fall at home in the form of poverty, ill health, discrimination. With 140 million Americans still below the poverty line, conditions haven't gotten that much better given all the decades that have passed. Now, on the positive side, the passage of the Biological Weapons Convention and of the Chemical Weapons Convention are testimony that nations can desist from the use of entire classes of weaponry. And the entry into the force of the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, tomorrow's the anniversary, no doubt opened up a new chapter, at least in the world, in the effort to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Sadly, President Trump's withdrawal from the Intermediate Forces Treaty, the Iran nuclear agreement, was steps backwards. Certainly, one of the forces behind these backward policies is the enormous profits made by the nuclear weapons industry from sales, maintenance, and upgrade of nuclear weapons, with the public financing it. Monopoly, you can't outsource the contracts to the Chinese, and the government buys the weapons, whether or not they're worth or not. Now, everybody here knows, with the US and other nations keeping thousands of nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert, well, I don't talk more about that. The threats to the use of nuclear weapons are not theoretical. The $50 billion in military aid to Ukraine on Russia's border will continue to drain our tax dollars from what our nation really needs: healthcare, pandemic protection, childcare, clean water, affordable housing, eviction protections. We need to send a clear message to the president, to the Congress, to our friends and neighbors to pull back from the brink of unnecessary and unsound military confrontations abroad. We have to make clear to our fellow citizens, not easy, that the enormous expenditures of going to war will only continue to undermine civilian programs people desperately need. Now, I want to thank our program committee, David Boris, Sandy Eaton, Joe Gerson, Robert Gould, Cole Harrison, Susan Mercy, Barb Redwine, Patricia Weinman, to all the speakers and panelists. Special thanks to our conference support staff, Cole, Brian Garvey, Kate Henning of Mass Peace Action, and also to David Lewis of the MIT Faculty Newsletter, Patricia Corbett and Reverend Nina Litton from MIT Radius, and the Norris Rugel Charitable Fund and Amy Rugel Giving Fund for their financial support. Over the next 2 hours, we'll have 2 plenary sessions, followed by a break. The first breakout sessions follow at 3:10. The breakouts are meant to be working meetings to set priorities and plans in the area of the workout in the coming period. And after the first breakout sessions, we'll hear from Representative Jim McGovern, Archbishop Lester, and then move into a second set of breakouts. It may be a little complicated getting everybody in. And then our closing plenary will attempt to point the way forward to a diplomacy, peace, transfer of military expenditures to civilian needs. So running the first session will be Susan Mirsky, chair of the very active and substantial Nuclear Weapons Nuclear Disarmament Working Group of Mass Peace Action. Susan, it's all yours.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to our first panel. Just to let you know, we have 4 incredible speakers in this first panel on the threat of nuclear weapons. Each panelist will have 8 minutes to speak, and after each will be 4 minutes for question and response. So obviously, put your questions into chat, and we probably won't have time to get to all of your good questions, but remember that really the questions and the responses and the discussion mostly takes place in the breakout sessions. So please enter those breakout sessions. Be ready to discuss your issues and your ideas. Let's go first to our first speaker, Phyllis Bennis, wonderful Phyllis Bennis, who is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, where she directs the New Internationalism Project. Her books include Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power, and Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer. She works with a number of anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations across the U.S. and globally, and speaks and writes widely on U.S. wars and foreign policy. Here today to talk about the threat of nuclear war, Phyllis Bennis. Thank you.
Many thanks, Susan, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for this always crucial discussion. I'm actually not going to talk today particularly on nuclear weapons. My colleagues are far more nuanced in their discussions of that than I am. I'm going to leave that to them, but I want to talk a little bit about the international crises that we're facing that include the nuclear crisis. You know, the global situation right now is terribly complicated. And the pandemic, the rising inequality, massive poverty, the enormous climate crisis that's underway, the refugee crises around the world, and the rise of authoritarian governments to a much higher degree than earlier. And one of the things that I think is new this round, if you will, is that unlike earlier eras where the Cold War era gave rise to the post-Cold War era, and then we had the global war on terror, and each era kind of defined by war, still left behind what had come before. This time around, what we're seeing is a new era of what they're calling near-peer competition, near-peer threat of war, very close with Russia right now over Ukraine, increasingly tense with China over Taiwan. But during that time, the global war on terror, which was the last era, continues. So we have the continuation of that global war on terror playing out in Yemen, in Somalia, in Syria, in Niger, as well as, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq. The big difference, of course, in the nature of the war, that we no longer are seeing massive troop deployments, but are seeing airstrikes and drones as the main way it's carried out. But nonetheless, the war on terror continues in this new era. We see new bases, new US bases being built in Africa, the US competing with China and escalating military tensions there. So we have, in a sense, a new level of multipolarity around the world, but it's not necessarily democratizing people's lives, because the other thing we're seeing is the rise of repressive authoritarian governments in places from Hungary and Poland to Turkey and the Philippines, Russia, Israel, the UAE, Saudi, all these places where repression and authoritarianism is so much on the rise, much of it linked to rising authoritarianism in the United States. Steve Bannon was just showing up in Brazil with the protesters who were against the re-election of the great Brazilian president Lula. So this is a serious challenge, even in a period when the so-called near peers of the US, who are defined because they are nuclear powers, that's what makes them near peers. Because, you know, we should be clear, China spends just over a third of what the US spends on its military. Russia spends less than 8% of what the US spends on its military, but they're powerful because they have those nuclear weapons. So how to organize new international relations becomes really, really difficult. The United Nations, of course, should be the centerpiece of all of this, but it's really not capable of doing that. In the context of the global rise of authoritarianism, including in these so-called democratic countries where there's shifts going on, we have new challenges, and new challenges for the new generation to create these new governing and so-called security structures. Some good news on that front: the protests in Iran, while they are being suppressed so brutally, are also seeing a level of independence that is really exciting. They're mostly rejecting US sponsorship, as is true in so many of the popular uprisings going on. So we're seeing the centrality of social movements as key to this challenge to the right-wing authoritarianism that's on the rise, as well as opposition to US hegemony, militarism of the US and others around the world, as these authoritarian governments are seen to be destroying the environment, they're militarizing societies, impoverishing and repressing local populations. So all of that is looking now to social movements to challenge it. The Ukraine war, of course, in the context of the centrality of militarism in all of this, the Ukraine war is very much at the center, both because of how it's being covered in the media in the West, but also because of the very, very real dangers of that war, the reality of the global threats that war is creating. Certainly, first and foremost, the threat of a nuclear escalation in that war, when we have the two largest nuclear powers, the US and Russia, facing off against each other without even a modicum of military to military hotline capacity, the way they've put together in Syria and other places, makes it incredibly dangerous. But we also are seeing the impact of that war on the global South, the rise of the threat of famine because of grain shipments that are unable to be sent around the world, the environmental destruction of it because more fossil fuels than ever are now being mined around the world. So there's enormous consequences for the whole world in this war in Ukraine, which is why we desperately need to maintain the call and escalate the call for an immediate ceasefire, for diplomacy, for a negotiated solution to the war in Ukraine, rather than relying on the escalation of more and more weapons. So what would a global security architecture look like? I mean, we are seeing the dangers from Ukraine, whatever, it's true that there is a danger of a Russian triumph, in my view, in Ukraine would be disastrous. We also have to look at what are the dangers of this war being continued the way it is. We see escalating militarism all around the world in response to the war in Ukraine. Europe was defining itself for the last 4, 5, 6 decades as being a project based on human rights, the project of Europe. No longer. Europe is now the project of militarism, with escalation of the membership of NATO, including countries like Sweden and Finland, long supporters of neutrality and a peaceful foreign policy. No longer. Popular support for joining NATO, spending more on the military. That means less money in all of these countries for healthcare, for workers' pay. All the issues that are now the subject of strikes across Europe are going to get worse as a result of the war in Ukraine. the willingness of more countries to spend 2% of their GDP on the military is rising. It's not only Germany, the one we're hearing about. It's a lot of other countries are now saying they will do that.
1 minute.
Let me close. Yeah, let me just close out with the question of movements. At the end of the day, with all of these challenges, the existence of nuclear arsenals that could threaten the survival of this planet and everything alive on it, as well as in the more immediate crises that we face around the world, social movements are what we need to challenge those militaristic tendencies that we're seeing on the rise everywhere we look. That's what today's events are all about, and I'm really glad to be part of it with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. And now we have time for questions. There are 2 questions so far. Marvin Higgins asks, has the U.S. mobilized for war? And Dan Bowerman asks, what solutions do you see for encouraging democratization in South America, and what can we do as U.S. citizens to help?
Well, those are pretty big questions for 4 minutes, but on the first one, I think the question of is the U.S. mobilizing for war is an important one in the sense of making all people in this country aware of and paying a price for and knowing about how they are being forced to pay a price for these wars. No, the whole reality of the so-called all-volunteer military, which of course is not voluntary at all. It's just that it's not a legal draft. It's a poverty draft. It's a no alternative draft. It's a draft based on, it's the only way to get health care for my family. It's a draft based on there's no other jobs available. It is a draft. And that means that it's disproportionately impacting the poorest people. It's less racially disproportionate than it was during Vietnam, although it still is a slight amount. But it is in terms of, if you look at where are people coming from who end up in the military? Small towns, rural areas, without options for education, for jobs, et cetera. So in the sense of, are people in this country aware, as we heard earlier, 53% of our national budget, what the Congress is spending, is going to the military. Do people know that? And in just a new report, I forgot the percentage, in 2017, it was 23%. In 2017, there were 23,000 active duty members of the military whose families were paid so little they qualified for food stamps. That number is now higher because paying the baseline soldiers at the bottom levels of the hierarchy is not the priority. When we hear about, we can't abandon the troops. Yeah, well, we're not abandoning the troops. Their commanders and the Congress are abandoning the troops because of where the money is going. Half of it goes directly to military corporations. So is the US being mobilized to support it on the basis of patriotism and equal willingness to sacrifice? I would say no, absolutely not. Just quickly on Latin America, I would say there is great news in Latin America. We have 3 presidents that have been elected in the last 6 or 8 months in Colombia, in Chile, and in Brazil. I would say that at IPS, we are very proud that every one of them in the last 15 years has been the recipient of the Letelier Moffitt Human Rights Award that we give every year. So we're claiming credit for all of them. But what we're seeing, for example, in Brazil is that Lula's election is already being challenged. Steve Bannon is on the ground helping to mobilize this right-wing opposition. There is nothing secure about the new rise of what some are calling the pink tide. Others are just saying it's a democratic wave in Latin America. That's what we need to be supporting. We need to be focusing on supporting the movements that are opposing mining. In El Salvador, just about a week ago, the arrest of 5 of the most notable water defenders who had been challenging the mining of the country that is destroying the environment, destroying the water in particular that people are so dependent on, have now been arrested for actions that they are alleged to have carried out. It's not even clear they had anything to do with them. We don't know any of that. Back in the days of the civil war in El Salvador, when they were connected to the FMLN. So what we're seeing now is a rise of repression across the continent, as well as a rise of democracy. We need to focus on what our government, whether it's through sanctions, whether it's through military support for these right-wing forces, that's what we need to be concentrating on to change that in our work here at the United States.
You're muted.
Yeah.
We have 20 seconds, no, 14 seconds left, and there are quite a few questions. So please send your questions to Phyllis, or if you're in a breakout with her, please ask them. Thank you so much, Phyllis.
Thank you all.
And now to our next panelist. It's my great pleasure to introduce a coworker and a wonderful woman, Elaine Scarry, who teaches at Harvard. She is the author of books on physical pain, the relationship between beauty and justice, and the peril of nuclear war. Her book, Thermonuclear Monarchy, shows how nuclear weapons have dismantled constitutional democracy, and in turn, how constitutional democracy can dismantle nuclear weapons. Elaine has long worked with Mass Peace Action and the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and was recently elected to the National Board of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Elaine.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to the committee that organized this conference and to all of you who are present. It was wonderful to listen to Phyllis just now, and I greatly look forward to the other lectures as well. Nuclear weapons have two remarkable features. One feature is the staggering level of injury that they bring about. The International Red Cross has said that if even a single city is hit, its worldwide resources won't be able to respond to the catastrophe. And there's an equally obscene second feature of nuclear weapons, and that is that all that injury, all that massive injury is brought about by a single person. Since we have in the United States a presidential launch authority where no second voice is required, and as Bruce Blair points out, the launch authorization is half the length of a tweet. During Trump's administration, people began to see how wildly irrational this is, and so too in listening to Putin and some of his colleagues, people have a concrete picture of how outrageous this situation is. But it doesn't just depend on leaders who seem somewhat reckless or who look slightly irrational to us or very irrational. We know historically that President Eisenhower contemplated first use of nuclear weapons in the Taiwan Straits in 1954 and again in Berlin in 1959. We know that JFK came within a hair's breadth of all-out nuclear war. We know that Lyndon Johnson considered a first strike against China in order to prevent China from getting a nuclear weapon, and Nixon has said that he 4 times considered it. So on the one hand, you have this incredibly magnified injury, and on the other hand, a miniaturization of authority and responsibility. It's important to realize that there are 2 very, very important tools that will enable us to dismantle this nuclear architecture. And the first of them is international law and the International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was signed by 92 countries and ratified by 68 countries. And the second tool is national law or constitutional law that we have in the United States and in most of the other nuclear states that requires that its country not go to war unless and until there's a debate about it in Congress or the legislature or parliament. Each one of these tools, the international law and the national constitutional law, has the ability to dismantle the entire nuclear architecture. But clearly, we have a much greater chance of bringing that about if we support both these tools, because the two tools have slightly different features and work in slightly different ways. International law addresses the obscene level of injury that I described. It talks about the humanitarian consequences of war. Constitutional law or national law addresses the sole authority and the procedures for authorization. There are other important differences between them. International law brings pressure to bear on a nuclear state from outside its borders. Constitutional law brings pressure to bear from inside its borders. It's also the case that there are advantages and disadvantages of either one. For example, international law is often perceived by national leaders as optional. Right now, none of the nuclear state leaders has not only not signed or ratified, but not even acknowledged the existence of the International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. National leaders don't have the option to disown their own constitutions. It's non-optional. It's also the case that international law differs from national law in that it's much more overtly ethical in its sound, in its procedure, and therefore can garner a great deal of support since it overtly addresses the issue of injury. National law, by contrast, sounds somewhat coldly procedural, and yet I assure you it has centuries of moral thinking and moral argument embedded in those procedures. Finally, international law is total in what it asks for. It asks for total abolition as well as reparations for those who have already been injured in the Marshall Islands, as well as, of course, in Japan, whereas national law, constitutional law sounds partial. All we're going to do is eliminate presidential first use. But as I'll argue in the few minutes I have remaining, it's incorrect to think of the elimination of first use as merely partial. It goes a very long way towards taking out the whole nuclear architecture. Think for a moment, if every country took the position of no first use, that would right there be the end of the potential for nuclear conflict. In terms of covering distance, we've gone a huge distance in a small number of years. A few years ago, most people in the United States did not know that our nuclear weapons stood to be launched by a single person, and that our country has and has long had a first use position. Now, many more people know that, and no first use is a major position of many, many peace groups in the United States. Crucially, and somewhat miraculously, we have at least 3 pieces of legislation in Congress. They've got a long way to go to be passed, but we have them on the books in Congress, and they'll be renewed in the new Congress. The Markey-Liu bill restricting the first use of nuclear weapons in the absence of a congressional declaration, the Warren-Smith bill requiring the country to take a no first use position, and Jim McGovern's bill that embraces both the international treaty on prohibiting nuclear weapons and eliminates first use and carries out 4 other provisions of the Back from the Brink. If passed, and that's a big if passed, these pieces of legislation would, I believe, come to be known as the most important pieces of legislation in the nuclear age. Sometimes people worry that eliminating first use will leave intact second use, and they argue rightly that second use is almost as obscene as first use. But will second use remain intact if first use is eliminated? There's a big question about that, because since at least 1946, it's been widely recognized that nuclear weapons are first use weapons. They make miserable second use weapons. And therefore, if you eliminate the first useness of first use weapons, then you eliminate the weapons. I'm overstating it, but I hope you see the logic of what I'm arguing. A similar thing is true of sole authority. Some people say, well, if you eliminate sole authority, you'll still allow Congress to launch a weapon. But as has again been recognized since 1946, the spectacle of 535 people, which is what the number would be today, in open debate about whether to launch a weapon is preposterous. And again, since the beginnings of the nuclear age, it's been recognized that nuclear weapons and a legislature are mutually incompatible. The doomsday clock throughout 20.
Sorry to end. We're trying to keep on time. We have 4 minutes for questions and response. And I'm looking here through the chat, and I see that there are a few questions. Jackie Gabasso asks, what do you see as potential terms for a negotiated resolution to the Ukraine war? Let's see.
That was directed to Phyllis, though.
Oh, was it? Oh, okay, that was an old one. Yes, to Phyllis. Let's see. Here we are. Oh, can we promote a voluntary declaration of a sole purpose nuclear deterrence by POTUS, Biden, aimed at addressing the matters arisen from dual use capacity of any delivery systems, any delivery means, such as missiles and battle airplanes, in order to reduce nuclear risks and dangers? And then Tim and Wallace asks, should we also prioritize international law? Peter Bergel asks, how long would no first use last in the face of military defeat? Also, what about misperceptions of attack from other countries? You can choose.
Yeah, those are a lot of questions. So would we retain no first use in the face of defeat? Well, presumably, if we, we have to aspire to eliminate the arsenals altogether, and that may seem like a very distant thing. Now, the peace philosopher John Ainsley in Britain pointed out that though it would take some years to physically dismantle the nuclear arsenals, actually dismantling all the nuclear triggers can be done in a matter of hours. So if a country agrees not to use weapons, then those triggers can be dismantled pretty quickly. Timon asked, should we prioritize international law? I think we just have to work on both fronts, both constitutional law and international law. As citizens, we presently have more say in constitutional law than we have in international law. Once our Congress embraces international law, then we as citizens can have to stand by that law, and we can stand by it even now before we're officially have our country and our citizenship placed under its canopy. But we are right now under the canopy of constitutional law and have the obligation to uphold it right now. So the answer is no, I wouldn't be tempted to choose one. I would put one's shoulder to the wheel wherever the wheel is closest to your shoulder. And if it's closest in the international, then work there. If it's closest on the national and constitutional, work there. I think there were other questions, Susan, but I could take in those two and apologize for not being able to take in more.
Well, we have a few minutes left. How long would no first use last in the face of military defeat? And also, what about misperceptions of attack from another country?
Misperceptions of attack from another country are one of the most probable ways that we will all end up in a nuclear war. Again, defeat from another country, the only way we will avoid being defeated by another country is by eliminating nuclear arsenals worldwide. Someone points out, and now I'm forgetting the person who should be attributed here, that that since the War of 1812, there hasn't been a chance of somebody really invading our country with an army. But with nuclear weapons, that's very simple, and not just for somebody who, for a country that has the kind of arsenal we do. Right now, the United States and Russia together own 90% of the world arsenal. But the damage that can be done by even the smallest arsenal, which is North Korea's of 40 or fewer warheads, is absolutely enough to defeat our entire country. So the only way we can eliminate the possibility of being defeated is by working to eliminate the worldwide nuclear arsenal. And if many of these other countries, including at one moment even North Korea, have expressed willingness to adopt a first use policy, it's only the United States that has, as far as I know, never said that it would adopt a first use policy. Once the United States does that, bringing along other countries who have already stated that at one time or another as their position is certainly within the realm of possibility.
Thank you so much, Elaine.
Thank you, Susan.
Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alan Robach. He's a distinguished professor of climate science in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Rutgers University. His areas of expertise include climate intervention, also called geoengineering, climate effects of nuclear war, and effects of volcanic eruptions on climate. In 2022, Professor Robach was a winner of the Future of Life Award for reducing the risk of nuclear war by developing and popularizing the science of nuclear winter. Alan, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war that Elaine mentioned. This is our beautiful planet, but after a nuclear war, it might look like this, with clouds of smoke covering it, spreading into the southern hemisphere and blocking out the sun. If there was enough smoke, we would get nuclear winter. Temperatures would get below freezing, it would be cold, dry, dark, and it would be a huge threat to crops and produce global famine. In 1945, during the first nuclear war, a 15-kiloton bomb killed about 150,000 people. Here's a photo. On the left is the mushroom cloud from the from the bomb, but on the right is a picture that is sometimes attributed to the mushroom cloud, but it's really a pyrocumulonimbus, a thunderstorm full of smoke that's took place 3 hours after the bombing because of the huge fires that were started in Hiroshima, and that pumped smoke up into the atmosphere, and that's what would happen after a nuclear war. So we looked at what would happen if India and Pakistan had a nuclear war. And imagine in Kashmir, skirmish escalating. Here's a movie I made from our computer model. You can see on the right where the smoke is spreading around the world. And on the left is the vertical profile of the atmosphere. This black line is the tropopause. We live down here where there's rain that could wash out the smoke, but up in the stratosphere, it would stay for years blowing around the world. And then we also looked at what would happen if the US and Russia had a nuclear war, and that would produce a lot more smoke. And here's a movie of that showing much thicker smoke. So we've done new calculations of different scenarios of a war between India and Pakistan and between the US and Russia. And they would produce different amounts of smoke, 5 to 150 million tons of smoke from different numbers of weapons. And the direct fatalities would be horrific, as we already know. Millions of people could die just from the blast, fires, and radioactivity. But it would be much worse than that. If we look at the temperature changes caused by the smoke, it would last for years. A war between the US and Russia, this green line, temperatures would go 10 degrees Kelvin, 20 degrees Fahrenheit below normal. And during the last ice age, the temperatures were only 5 degrees below. So even a war between India and Pakistan could produce ice age temperatures for several years. And what we really care about is how this would affect our food. So we published a paper earlier this year called Global Food Insecurity and Famine from, it's a long title, Global Famine After Nuclear War. And we used our climate model and crop models to calculate in each country how much food there would be left after we used up our stores. The average amount of food stored is about a couple months' supply. And this is an open access, everybody has access to it. We used a crop model to calculate for every the main crops, corn, rice, soybeans, and wheat, and grasses that animals eat, how in each country the food would change. And we did different scenarios of whether we keep our animals and or eat their food. And we looked for every country. And for these different amounts of smoke, this is the number of people that would have food after 2 years, after we used up our food supply. And this is the number of people that might be in danger. So if you look at a map of the world, this is for a war between India and Pakistan. The brown is less than 5% of the people will be alive at the end of 2 years. The orange is less than 25%. In the tropics, there would be changes of food. We assume that there would be no trade. People would hoard their food. They would keep it like we hoarded toilet paper. And countries that have small populations like Australia and export would still have enough food for everybody. What about a war between the US and Russia? In that case, most of the world would have no food at the end of a year, of 2 years. A few countries like Argentina and Australia would have enough food for their people. But you can imagine, if you think refugees are a problem, you can imagine the flotillas of hungry people headed that way. So it would be really horrific. And if we calculate how many people would be alive at the end of 2 years, for an India-Pakistan war, 1 to 2 billion people could die. For a US-Russia war, more than 5 billion people could die. And this is using data from about 10 years ago when there were only 6.4 billion people in the world. So as Elaine mentioned, the Nobel Peace Prize went to ICANN for their work to start the treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons and get it through the United Nations, and also to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any nuclear weapons use, which includes our work and also the direct effects. The treaty came into effect 2 years ago, and now there are currently 92 signatories and 68 countries that have ratified it. And as Elaine said, the nuclear nations are still trying to ignore the will of the rest of the world. When Beatrice Finn, the director of ICANN, accepted the Nobel Prize, she said, "The story of nuclear weapons will have an ending, and it's up to us what that ending will be. Will it be the end of nuclear weapons, or will it be the end of us? One of these things will happen. The only rational course of action is to cease living under the conditions where our mutual destruction is only one impulsive tantrum away." This was 5 years ago when Kim and Trump were arguing about whose button was bigger. Carl Sagan, the great astronomer who was part of the first work on nuclear winter, was asked, "Carl, don't you think we should keep our weapons?" He said, "For myself, I would far rather have a world in which the climatic catastrophe cannot happen, independent of the vicissitudes of leaders, institutions, and machines. It seems to me elementary planetary hygiene as well as elementary patriotism." You can see why he's such a great communicator. I agree. Elementary planetary hygiene demands that we eliminate nuclear weapons faster than the current pace. And I hope that we end up having a world looking like this for many years to come. If you want more information, you can go to my website. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was a very clear presentation of what can happen and why we are all here today. Let's see, going to questions. We have a question, let's see, from let's see, let me just get to these. Sorry for this. Looking here. Two questions. Marvin Higgins says, "Has the U.S. mobilized for war?" And Dan Bowerman, "What solutions do you see?" Let me get to a new one. Let's hold off on that. I think I am, here, a question from Dan Bowerman. "Has anyone done a model like this in a situation where Putin uses one of his nuclear armed torpedoes?" That's one. And let's get to another.
Let me just answer that.
That
The
was-
climate response depends on how much smoke goes into the atmosphere. We use a scenario of India and Pakistan having a nuclear war because 15 years ago, that seemed the most likely place in the world. Now, Putin, of course, is threatening. If one bomb is used, then it would produce smoke, but it would be horrific locally, but it wouldn't cause global climate change. So there are other scenarios. For example, China and India, they were fighting along their border recently. Or what if North Korea launches a bomb on South Korea, or Japan and the US launches one back, and maybe it hits Vladivostok by mistake or goes over China and they start launching their weapons. Or what if China and Taiwan have a war? So there are many different scenarios that could produce lots of smoke from different cities being targeted by large weapons. And the amount of smoke will determine the climate change. The smoke stays up for years, so it doesn't really matter where it goes in, it will be spread around the world. So you can think of lots of different scenarios. And the only scenario that makes any sense is never to use them and never produce any smoke. So, by the way, we claim we keep our weapons for deterrence. But if we launched our arsenal at Russia and they didn't do anything back, we would all die from the climate change. We would all starve to death. So threatening to use your weapons as a deterrent is the action of a suicide bomber. It makes no sense at all. They have to believe you're crazy even for deterrence to work. So the only solution is to, like Elaine said, take out the triggers and dismantle the bombs.
Okay, along the same lines, yes, what would be the impact of a targeted nuclear attack, which is discussed frequently in the news, preparing us, it feels like, for the possible use of weapons?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you mean by targeted nuclear attack? Like I said, the amount of smoke depends on the size of the weapon and the target. If you target cities and industrial areas, they will burn and produce lots of smoke. We have evidence of that. Unfortunately, we have a few cities that burn. San Francisco burned in 1906, pumping smoke up into the atmosphere after an earthquake. And so if bombs were dropped in the ocean or in deserts like we did when we tested in the atmosphere, it wouldn't produce climate change because there was nothing to burn. So it really depends on the targets. But once even one weapon is used, it's really hard to imagine how it might not escalate. That could start, people would panic, they would start using their weapons, and it doesn't make a limited nuclear war is really wishful thinking if you want to use nuclear war at all. Any nuclear weapons, I mean, this is sort of anecdotal, but the only nuclear war we've had, the entire global arsenal of nuclear weapons was used. We dropped 2 on Japan. And there's no reason to think that that wouldn't happen again.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. That brings to mind, what you just said, the last images of Dr. Strangelove, which was the back and forth, and so thus the sense of limited nuclear war, perhaps not being quite so limited. Thank
and
you.
When Daniel Ellsberg was asked about that movie, he said, "What did you think about that?" He said, "It looked like a real life scenario. It didn't look like something imaginary." So
exactly. Yes. Thank you so much, Alan,
sure.
for your presentation. Now let's go to our last speaker, William Hartung. Bill Hartung is the former director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. He's a former senior research fellow in the New America Foundation America Strategy Program and is the former director of the Arms Trade Resource Center at the World Policy Institute. He specializes in questions of weapons proliferation, the economics of military spending, and alternative approaches to national security strategy. Hartung is the director of the Arms and Security Initiative at the New America Foundation. Prior to that, he was the director of the Arms Trade Resource Center at the World Policy Institute. Bill.
Yes, thank you.
Andrew was asking.
I'm currently at the Quincy Institute, just to keep people up to date. But thanks to Phyllis and Elaine and Alan for laying out in some detail what's at stake here. My title of my talk was The Extraordinary Costs of Nuclear Modernization Programs. So you might think I was going to talk about money, which I will in a second. But of course, the biggest cost of building a new generation of nuclear weapons is that it keeps the nuclear arms race alive, and it keeps the possibility of nuclear Armageddon alive. And of course, we can't forget that. The new intercontinental ballistic missile that's now being developed is supposed to last till 2075. If that's the case, none of us will probably be here at the end of that period. And even the notion of nuclear modernization, you know, some people might say, well, if we're going to have nuclear weapons, they might as well be the new ones, you know. Or there's terms in the nuclear kind of experts realm, things like life extension. You know, if they keep the current intercontinental ballistic missiles functional for another 15 or 20 years, they call it life extension. But of course, we don't want to extend the lives of the weapons. We want to extend the lives of humanity. So, you know, there's a language problem as well as a security problem for humanity. So anyway, I'm going to talk about one of the things that's keeping this all going, which is, of course, money. It's not the only thing. There's also the whole ideological attachment to the notion of deterrence and so forth. But, you know, the nuclear weapons buildup that's planned by the Pentagon could cost $2 trillion over the next 30 years. And close to $700 billion just in the next decade, which is well higher than the Biden administration's investment in dealing with climate. We could more than double that investment if we got rid of nuclear weapons, all the costs of building, maintaining, developing, of course. And every element is hugely expensive. You know, bombers at $550 million each before you factor in the inevitable cost overruns. And they want to build 100 of those. Submarine ballistic missile submarines at $12 to $15 billion a year. So each one of them is more expensive than the budget of the Environmental Protection Agency or the Centers for Disease Control or other agencies that actually save human lives rather than threaten to destroy them. And then we have the intercontinental ballistic missiles, which former Secretary of Defense William Perry has said are some of the most dangerous weapons we have because they have to be launched on short notice in a crisis, giving the president just a few minutes to decide whether to send them against an adversary. So it increases the risk of a nuclear war based on a false alarm. And even some fairly mainstream figures who have been involved in the nuclear complex believe they should be abolished as a first step towards getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether. But those will cost over $260 billion over their lifetime. So it's the most expensive piece of this ongoing buildup. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has not rolled this back. There was one small weapon system, the sea-launched nuclear armed cruise missile, that they wanted to stop the development of. Congress put it back in the budget. So we're basically on the same path we were under Trump, under Obama, since the time that the Pentagon first cooked up this notion of building a new generation of nuclear weapons. And one of the reasons this continues, of course, is the political influence of the companies. And just to note along the way, if you want a good sense of which companies are profiting from nuclear weapons, ICANN puts out regular reports on this, one of which I put in the chat, and not just who produces them in the US, but globally as well. But in the US context, companies like Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, General Dynamics, the big five weapons contractors, give tens of millions of dollars to members of Congress every year to have access and influence over them. And the new Republican Congress, Mike Rogers, who's going to run armed services, got over $400,000 from weapons contractors in the last cycle. And Ken Calvert, who will run defense appropriations in the House, got almost $400,000. So the money's flowing, and it's just one element. You've also got the revolving door where people go from these companies, from the Pentagon rather, to work for these companies and lobby for them. And also the reverse, people go from these companies into government. One of the most stunning examples is 4 of the last 5 secretaries of defense worked for nuclear weapons contractors before they went into government. So James Mattis, Patrick Shanahan, Lloyd Austin, who was at Raytheon. So from top to bottom, there's not only an ideology of promoting nuclear weapons, but there's people who have benefited economically from that whole process. And then beyond that, of course, there's funding of think tanks. And there's a great new study by two researchers out of Paris about exactly how nuclear weapons contractor funding influences think tanks that help shape the debate on nuclear weapons. And a lot of it is what they don't say. You're not going to hear the Brookings Institution or the Atlanta Council having an expert who talks about the need for nuclear abolition, to put it mildly. It's also who they choose as experts. They choose experts who are advocates of sustaining nuclear weapons and building a new generation. And then sometimes there's more blatant things like getting critical studies canceled. And then finally, for the companies, it's kind of a form of reputation laundering. We're funding serious studies about nuclear risks and so forth, but all with the goal of keeping the funding and the weapons programs alive. And then finally, there's the jobs issue. And even a relatively small number of jobs can propel the complex. So for example, in the Senate, there's an ICBM coalition, and the members are from smaller states like Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, where there's either ICBM bases or a lot of work being done to modernize those weapons. And the senators from those states have managed to block
Bill, 1 minute.
The senators from the states have managed to block efforts to reduce ICBMs, to even study reducing them, to eliminate unused silos for ICBMs in case they want to have a buildup later. So they've been incredibly effective because they've got the money of the industry behind them, because they've got the politics of Washington where they sort of argue, well, if you want to keep the Senate, you don't want to do anything that hurts me in my state. John Tester, one of the last Democrats from that area, has been running defense appropriations activities in the Senate. So we have to go after the jobs issue and these flows of money as one element of the campaign to get rid of nuclear weapons. And I think it's possible to do that if you look at campaigns like "Don't Bang on the Bomb," and some of the new work done by researchers like Miriam Pemberton, who has a whole new book on how to convert the military economy. There's things we can do. It's an amazing fight, and there's so much at stake. That's why I'm glad we're having this meeting today, because we're going to hear from people who are doing the organizing, which I think is the most important element of all this.
Thank you so much, Bill. We have quite a few questions for you. Let's start with, let's see. Please, can you give us more clarity on the budget for nuclear within the Energy Department and where the line is with nuclear budget in DOD? And then also, do you see the US joining the European conflict, Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, either with regular weapons or nuclear? There are other questions. Decades ago, there was much more popular resistance to nuclear militarization. Today, this is not the case. What has changed? We have 4 minutes for you to answer any and all. Good
Great.
luck.
Well, if we can answer those in 4 minutes, we don't have to have the conference next year. I think first of all, the current budget, Pentagon and DOE for nuclear weapons is about $50 billion that we know of. Of course, there's secret programs. DOE, Atomic Energy Defense Activities, runs at about $20 billion a year. So that includes things like producing the triggers for nuclear weapons, some dismantlement, a lot of the research on modernizing, making more deadly and accurate nuclear weapons. They're essentially, the DOE is responsible for the warheads, and the Pentagon is responsible for the delivery vehicles. And in terms of the third question, how to get the kind of mobilization we saw, say, in the 80s when we rolled back the Reagan nuclear buildup. None of us are specialists on that, obviously, but I think the humanitarian consequences are our strongest, sort of argument, and the moral issue. Is it moral for any president, any government, to have the right to end life as we know it. And I think the problem is people feel discouraged about changing anything about government, small or large. And so I think we need a revived democracy movement at a time when, of course, our democracy is under more threat than it's been in many years. So I think because it's about democracy and the future of the planet, we can build broader coalitions of people working on different issues, be it climate, be it others, with the understanding that we can't just show up at their meetings and say, our issue is better than your issue, but rather talk about how they intersect and how we might work together, and especially younger generations of activists and advocates who I think have a more holistic view of politics and of the future of the world. So I'm hopeful that we can make progress, whether it would be 1 million people in Central Park or a more distributed kind of political network globally is unclear, but it's unlikely it'll be exactly as it happened in the 80s. But we can certainly build the movement to be much larger and more powerful than it is now.
Thank you so much, Bill. And yes, here's to us solving all of these problems, and no conference next year except in celebration. Thank you all. And now I want to turn it over to Rosemary Keene, who is the co-chair of Massachusetts Peace Action. Thank you.
Thanks for that wonderful first panel. And now we'll move directly on to our second panel of speakers. And thanks to Bill Hartung for giving us kind of a smooth segue and talking about the real cost of nuclear weapons. The second panel is speaking to the social and economic costs of the nuclear weapons buildup. And we have 4 people, Shaylee Gupta Barnes, Deborah Berger, Mike Connolly, and Jonathan King. And our first speaker will be Shaylee Gupta Barnes. And let me just remind folks who came a little later, each speaker has 8 minutes, and I will hopefully pay attention and give you the 1-minute warning when you're getting close to that 8 minutes. And then we have 4 minutes for questions for each speaker. And those questions should be put into the chat, and we'll do our best to manage them. If you have a question that doesn't get answered, please take it to your breakout group, because that is where we have more time for discussion. Okay. Shaylee Gupta Barnes is going to talk to us about poverty as a byproduct of the war economy. Shaylee is the policy director for the Kairos Center and the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. She has a background in law, economics, and human rights, and has spent over 15 years working with and for poor and marginalized communities. Shaylee's understanding of justice, morality, and liberation draws on her Hindu and Jain background and her close engagement with communities of struggle. And today, she's speaking about poverty as a byproduct of war. Thank you, Shaylee.
Rosemary and everyone who's here who brought this conference together. As you all know, those of us who are committed to peace and justice, understanding the social and economic costs of war is always pressing. And then right now, where we have this ballooning military budget passed with support from both parties, while legislation that would benefit poor families and poor children didn't even get to the floor, it's even more so. We really have to understand what's at stake and how we change that. And I just have to say quickly that I'm really honored to be here with Deborah and Representative Connolly and Jonathan King. Here in New York, we were actually out very recently supporting the nurses who won more staffing and pay increases at Montefiore, showing that when the nurses are outside, something is wrong inside, and that when we fight, we win. And so just really thankful to be here with all of you too. So I'm here to talk about poverty as a byproduct of the war economy from my position and as the policy director of the Poor People's Campaign, which, as you know, is a national campaign. We're organized across 35 states in the country, hundreds of national partners, including many of you who are on this call, in this conference. And our analysis and our strategy begins with the fact that there are 140 million poor and low-income people in this country. Now, neither political party is doing very much that makes their lives better permanently on a permanent basis. And so we're building a base among these millions of people and their moral allies. And our state committees, we have 35 state committees across the country. We have tens of thousands of members who have found a way to bring together the injustices they're facing every day, systemic racism, poverty, climate crisis, and of course, the war economy, and to find together a sense of agency and power that honestly they may have never experienced. So as a policy director, I spend a lot of time confronting and trying to dismantle the narratives that hold up and perpetuate these injustices. And perhaps the biggest, and most dominant one of these is this lie of scarcity. We actually live in a time of abundance, but when you believe there isn't enough and you make others believe there isn't enough, then you can justify all kinds of things. And you can justify other narratives that say, for instance, we don't have the resources for everyone in this country to have what they need, and we have to make tough choices. Or we shift the blame onto individuals rather than looking at the systems and the structures that actually don't work for most of us. Or we say that some people deserve their lot in life. And maybe the most generous narrative is that some people were just born in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you do what you can, but again, you can't solve everyone's problems because there just isn't enough to do that. While this may be unfair, this is as good as it gets. So all of these narratives, they're more than just kind of bad ideas and mean words. They're actually used to justify our national priorities, how we spend the abundant resources we have, and they lie underneath why our government is so willing and so eager to support and fund war, but not social welfare programs. And there are costs to these narratives and to these choices. I mean, many of you are definitely aware of the more than $8 trillion spent on the post 9/11 wars and how that spending has driven up the budget deficit, the national debt, and future spending to pay down any of this. All of this has also come at the expense of better jobs. The military is often raised up as a jobs creator, but it's really inefficient at doing this. We could do a lot better, create more jobs if those dollars went to education or healthcare or infrastructure. There's obviously the unbearable human costs, the million deaths in these countries, the 38 million people who've been displaced, the thousands of service members, the trauma that they bring home, the pollution, cost of future generations, all of this is still to be tallied. But within, through this narrative of scarcity, our government, our society has chosen war. And when we're talking about spending on war, there's just never enough. More is always more, even if it's on weapons that don't work, that in fact create more problems, that threaten our very existence. It doesn't matter if the Pentagon fails every audit, more is always more is always better, no matter what the cost. But when you're talking about poverty programs, less is more. You have a program like the expanded child tax credit, which undeniably improved the lives of millions of poor children and poor households, and it doesn't even make the cut. So in addition to the direct costs of poverty, the costs of war that we already know, we have to add the costs of poverty. That's at least $1 trillion every year just on child poverty. And the fact that poverty and inequality kill 250,000 people every year, that's 700 people a day. This has even greater tolls when we're hit with a social crisis like the pandemic. And we see that poor communities suffer the most. Overall, during the pandemic, they had a COVID death rate that was twice as high as wealthier communities. It's sometimes even 5 times higher. So unless we actually address those narratives, that underlying logic, this will never change. So how do we do that? How do we actually confront and shift these narratives and change what's possible? Well, it's not just about words, it's about power. And power comes from organization. And power for poor people, well, what King said when he was organizing the Poor People's Campaign in 1967, 1968, what he said was that power for poor people would mean having the ability, the togetherness, the assertiveness, the aggressiveness to make the power structures of the system say yes when they may want to say no. And his vision and his strategy to amass that power was to bring the millions of poor and dispossessed people together across race to concentrate their numbers and their power against the triple evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. And today, as all of these injustices that he was confronting more than 50 years ago are even worse, impacting at least 140 million people, at least 40% of the country, we have a better chance of building this movement that he was preparing us for. So what we call this in my organization at the Kairos Center is a Kairos moment. That's a Greek term that refers to a moment in time that's a moment of crisis, but also of opportunity. It's a moment when movements are born that can shift the whole of society in a new direction. So our assessment in the campaign is to see that these struggles against systemic racism, against police violence and housing insecurity, and the denial of healthcare and voter suppression and massive poverty and low wages and the climate crisis, these are all also how we will push back against war. Not because one of these is more important than the other, but because they're all interrelated. And making gains in any of these areas, or in all of them, will ultimately build the organization, the numbers, and the power to advance the fight for peace, the kind of peace that will relieve us of the ravages of war, but also the kind of peace that gives us great schools and great healthcare and decent housing and safe communities and clean water and air and a chance to thrive. So this is what we're doing. And this is what I know so many of you are doing. And we invite you to join us so we can win everything that we deserve, because anything less than everything just isn't enough. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The questions are rolling in. See. Larry Holman asks, would more economic justice and equality across the globe reduce the likelihood of international competition and increase the likelihood of international cooperation and reduce the likelihood of violence? Shaylee, we have 4 minutes for not too much time.
I think the quick answer is yes. There was a report recently that came out from Oxfam that showed, Oxfam does this report every year showing the global wealth gap, basically, and how it's gotten even worse. But one of the things that Oxfam calls for is a really high wealth tax, a wealth tax of up to 75% on incomes of over $5 million, which, in the world over is basically the top 1%. This is a huge, this is not unprecedented, but basically what the report is calling for is greater economic justice and equality, not for its own sake, but also because that would ultimately lead to a better society for everybody. And so you can only imagine that if we were to move in that direction, if we were to, again, there is no scarcity of resources to address the problems we're facing, but they're all being held and concentrated and directed towards things that most of us don't actually want or need. And so if we're able to, whether it's moving towards this wealth tax, whether it's just kind of, mobilizing and organizing the billions of people around the world who actually, would want and are calling for and demand a world of peace, then, that's the direction we're heading towards. So yes, Larry, I think it would.
Thank you. We'll take this last question from Sain Leproyan. It seems to me that there is no abundance of caring people, no abundance of young men and women working to lessen the possibility of war. Shaylee, can you put that feeling in perspective for us?
Yeah, I think it is really hard sometimes to lose sight of the goodness that does exist when we are forced to live in a false scarcity, when we're forced to kind of fight for our own survival and the survival of those we love and care for, the ones who are kind of closest to us. That doesn't negate the fact that people do the best that we can, right? And I fundamentally believe that. I believe that we are all good. I believe that most of us are good and that most of us seek good. And part of why I believe that I'm able to hold that up is because of the people who I'm around every day, the people who are building this campaign, who are confronting all kinds of, who are leading this campaign, who have shown me that, a better way is possible, a better way is necessary, and they're building it from very scrappy origins, from very scrappy resources that, as the welfare rights and housing movement that I come out of says, they're making a way out of no way. And that is the hope that I lean on and call for and would like to share with you all in this time. There is actually a great abundance of these such people. We just have to find each other and fight for each other.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll move forward to our next speaker, who is Deborah Berger, president of the NNU, the National Nurses United, the largest union of nurses in the country in U.S. history. The NNU was founded in December of 2009 to counter the national assault by the healthcare industry on patient care conditions and standards for nurses. A couple of the NNU campaigns right now are expanding the voice of direct care nurses and patients in public policy, and winning accessible quality healthcare for all as a human right. So today, Deborah is speaking to us about starving public health, and we welcome you, Deborah. Oops, come back. And I think there, great.
Thank you and good afternoon. On behalf of the 225,000 members of National Nurses United, I'm honored to be invited to participate in this esteemed panel. I'm also grateful to our 35 affiliate nurses unions in Global Nurses United, whose bedside experience across 6 continents are the grounds for many of my comments today. Thank you, Massachusetts Peace Action, for hosting this important conference. I've been a bedside nurse for over 45 years and a union leader for more than 3 decades. I will begin my comments on the social and public health costs of militarization with some reflections on the structural violence and the global pandemic. Too often in the past 3 years, the front lines of the pandemic have been described as a war zone. It is true that the grave breakdown of public health infrastructure in many parts of the world left nurses battling our employers to provide adequate staffing, proper PPE, and necessary medical supplies as we fight to save patients' lives. In the United States, our government and employers abjectly failed to protect healthcare workers and our patients, leading to well over 1 million deaths, including 5,575 healthcare workers, 497 registered nurses, and 29 of our NNU union members. These unnecessary deaths were foreshadowed in government and media messages that equated a national pandemic response with war mobilization rather than a coordinated community care. In part, we were unprepared for the pandemic because America's public health care system has been hollowed out in favor of military spending and nuclear weapons buildup. Yet, during a peak in COVID deaths and calls to reopen the economy prematurely, the US military conducted a series of flyovers in many cities to salute so-called healthcare heroes. These costly and extremely symbolic gestures silenced on-the-ground demands for healthcare workers, a majority female and people of color workforce, who were being forced to put their lives on the line with little or no protections. These healthcare workers are being celebrated in these military salutes were not on active duty military. Recognizing them as military heroes in the line of duty made a very preventable crisis and dangerous on-the-ground conditions seem inevitable. Had the nation really wanted to use its military resources to support nurses and other healthcare workers, the government could have listened to the demands of healthcare workers and invoked the Defense Production Act to produce adequate supply of PPE. They did not do this. They left healthcare workers fending for themselves against corporate employers and turned the pandemic into a political war zone. From the perspective of bedside nurses globally, war is never a cause for celebration because war contributes to premature death and harm. War does not just harm active combatants, and it doesn't just kill and maim by bullets and bombs. War disrupts and destroys the productive economy that people depend on for food security and to meet basic needs. War devastates infrastructure, including water systems, public health systems, medical services, medicines, medical facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. War creates unhealthy environments and it increases human exposure to military toxics, hazards, and depleted uranium. Investment in war has resulted in staggering forms of mass violence across large parts of the world. US military action included countless coups, political assassinations, small-scale interventions to advance pro-business market goals and to expand corporate rights that undermine global protection of labor. Representing and regarding hospitals as a military front during the pandemic similarly contributed to the for-profit corporate agenda that holds our healthcare system and health equality hostage in this country. The use of social wealth and tax resources to build and sustain the military rather than fulfilling universal needs like clean water, health, food, housing, education, and universal healthcare system like Medicare for all deepens socially produced scarcities and social inequalities. The pandemic exposed the dangers of this inequality, calling on us to divest from military systems that produce global conflict and harm and redirect those resources into public health, public well-being, global solidarity, and care. It is precisely through such redistribution that we can lead the way to health equality. The military has over 800 US military bases in an estimated 80 foreign nations and territories. These bases are responsible for increased environmental damage, increased carbon emissions, violence, including sexual and violence and murder, and military accidents that compromise the health and safety of communities around the world. Nurses in our Global Nurses United network from Honduras to Puerto Rico repeatedly report higher rates of chronic stress, mental health crisis, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and violence in areas associated with arms sales and military presence. Half the US government's discretionary budget goes to military spending and weapons buildup, while vast numbers of people lack adequate health care, education, housing, and other basic needs. Union nurses believe that budgets are moral documents that should be dedicated to funding policies that sustain life instead of destroying life. As patient advocates, protecting the lives and health of patients is our top priority. This is why we put our union power behind fighting for policies that put resources into sectors of the economy that are focused on nurturing health, welfare, maintenance, and protection of all people.
For 1 minute.
Right now, excessive military spending is starving the care economy. Care work is labor intensive, and years of divestment in public infrastructure and profit seeking by private companies have left many healthcare workers, teachers, childcare providers, and other care workers with inadequate staff and safety protections. There are over 4.4 million RNs with active licenses in the United States, but only 3.2 million currently employed as nurses. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Nearly 1 in 5 healthcare workers in the US have quit their jobs due to exhaustion, unsafe conditions, and moral injury. So is my time up?
Is just about up.
Okay. Yes, the last 3 years have been a public health nightmare, and the continued gutting of public health care continues to turn our system into a disaster zone. Nurses and National Nurses United invite all of you to be involved with our fights for Medicare for All and for our patient care protections and healthcare justice network. And I know that they're putting those links in the chat. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you for the invitation to speak today.
Deborah, thank you so much. There are a lot of positive comments in the chat. Hearing this kind of analysis from a healthcare point of view, a nurse's point of view, it's clear that our group is very happy to hear it. Let's see, a question. Here's one. How does the closure of hospitals due to the loss of staffing threaten healthcare of our nation's citizens?
The closure of hospitals in the US are an attempt to increase profits in our country. There's really no reason that those hospitals needed to be closed, especially rural hospitals now where people have to drive hours to get treated in an emergency room in many of the hospitals. It is merely a for-profit procedure to deny access to healthcare, and we have continued to fight that. And it is imperative that we understand that in the Medicare for All bill, it provides improved access to care in the rural areas and make sure that all of our patients are properly treated. And during the pandemic, there were actually several hospitals that closed as we were needing more and more beds. So it only proves that that we do need the resources from healthcare to be better prioritized, and a nonprofit system like Medicare for All would do that.
Thank you. Here is a last question. The UN Secretary General called for a moratorium on all weapons production and a reinvestment in a more thorough pandemic response. Big question. Why did so few, if any, nations abide by this compassionate recommendation? And do you have an idea about how we might do better now?
I think everybody in this conference understand that we can do better, and we need to prioritize our systems, and that we do need to take these resources that are dedicated to military buildup and arms sales that we actually end up giving away to our police in our communities and recycle them there and use those weapons against us in our own communities. So I think everybody here completely gets the fact that we do need to have a better priority on where that money is spent.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Great. So moving right along, our next speaker is Massachusetts State Rep Mike Connolly. And Mike has represented the 26th Middlesex District in Massachusetts since winning his election over an incumbent in 2016. Mike is a lawyer, and he is a relentless progressive advocate and legislator, an unwavering ally of the peace movement. Mike will talk to us today about unmet housing needs. Thanks for being here, Mike.
Wow, thank you so much, Rosemary, for that generous introduction. And it's awesome to be here with Shaylee and Deborah and Jonathan King and Mass Peace Action and everyone who's joining us, all of the experts and members. And special thank you to Jonathan King. You know, I serve on the legislature's Housing Committee, but it was Jonathan who got me working on housing in our community about 11 years ago when I first moved here. And we realized that MIT had to do more for graduate student housing. And the more that I've dug into this issue, the more that I've been able to see the connections between budget policy and, of course, the unfortunate commitment that our federal government has to ever increasing military budgets, and how that really deprives us from even getting to the point where we can have a vision of housing as a human right. And, you know, I've found that it's easy to say those words, they sound nice, they sort of roll off the tongue. But when you get into the halls of power and you look for where, you know, people are actually working to try to map out how would we house everyone, what I find is that there's sort of this underlying assumption that we could never grasp the resources, that we could never actually get there. And so we get stuck in a mode of incrementalism, and it's really not working. You know, the reality in our country today is that there is no precedent for the affordable housing emergency that we now face. And we didn't have homelessness like this 50 years ago. We didn't have cost burden like this at other times in the past. You know, what we face today really has no precedent. And of course, you know, it starts with decades of austerity on the federal level, whether that's things like the Fair Cloth Amendment that have literally prohibited the construction of new federal affordable housing, or it connects to, you know, some of the tremendous disparities that we see. You know, I was double checking the numbers before the event this afternoon, and, you know, from what I found, President Biden's 2023 budget request for the Department of Housing and Urban Development was about $72 billion. And the 2023 defense budget I found at $1.01 trillion. So easily there, you know, what would that be? 15 times or so more goes into our military budget than into just our federal spending on housing. And so, you know, sort of backing up a little bit, I jumped into this right away. You know, that's the reality. And I think what is so important is to really have a vision. And so for me, as someone who was raised in public housing that was built in the 1950s by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as someone who's been a lifelong renter here in the city of Cambridge, where we ourselves have faced an ongoing affordable housing emergency for well over 2 decades now. For me, that vision really is a guaranteed program of housing for all people. And, you know, the connection can really be made between our military budget, between, you know, this unfortunate commitment to nuclear proliferation. Some of the work, you know, toward that endeavor happens here in Cambridge or with other contractors in Massachusetts. So it's a global issue and it's a local issue, but again, it's really this unwillingness to consider different priorities that really keeps us from considering what it would take to house all people. This session in the legislature here in Massachusetts, there are some, I think, really important opportunities. Certainly, we have a new governor here in Massachusetts. She's expressed a much greater interest in a range of housing policies than our previous Republican governor did. We also recently passed the Fair Share Amendment, which is really the first step forward for tax fairness and tax equity in our Commonwealth, the first major step forward in my lifetime. Massachusetts, you know, has a flat income tax, which, you know, is terribly inequitable when the person working a minimum wage job is taxed at 5% on their income. And say the owner of the New England Patriots, Bob Kraft, he's taxed at 5% of his income on the state level. We finally passed the Fair Share Amendment to overcome that. Although that doesn't directly relate to housing, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. Certainly, the intent of the Fair Share is to address transportation and education. Those are two painful local issues that are often part of why there's resistance to new housing and new affordable housing. So to the extent we can now, with more confidence, go around the Commonwealth and say to people, we can make adequate investments in education. Don't worry if, you know, new multifamily housing is being built in your district. We will be sending you more money for your schools. And likewise, you know, often traffic concerns can be an impediment to housing, and obviously investment in, you know, public transit, as well as maintaining our crumbling roads and bridges can obviously help on that front as well. I started a timer, so you're not going to have to warn me, Rosemary. I see I have about 1.5 minutes left. So, you know, real quickly, you know, I'll just mention a couple of other things. This session, I'm filing a number of interesting bills, and one that I'm particularly excited about is I filed a bill called the Massachusetts Social Housing Act. And this is legislation that would put the state government back in the business of building a form of public housing, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is social housing. And that's really characterized by, you know, mixed income, publicly funded and often owned or partnered housing. You know, I'm sure many of you know that when public housing originated in the United States, initially there was a thought to have it be mixed income, and real estate and banking interests in a very sinister way fought very hard to ensure it was only for poor people, so that they could try to divide us and try to keep public housing as a, you know, less than popular program. So looking forward to that. And in my final 30 seconds, I will mention I also have legislation directly that speaks to the issue of nuclear weapons, and this is House Docket 1539. We filed this week, and it's an act relevant to the divestment of state pension funds from nuclear weapons. And of course, we have a real proud history of divestment campaigns here in Massachusetts. Right here in Cambridge, you know, there were efforts to boycott the Polaroid Corporation for their involvement with apartheid South Africa. The great Governor Dukakis was a leader in tobacco divestment, and there's many other examples that have proved important. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to work with Mass Peace Action on the specific topics that we can address on a peace agenda in the state legislature, and of course, working with all of you to really get to that vision of guaranteed housing for all people. So I could talk, people know this, I could talk about housing for, I would guess, 80 hours nonstop. Believe me, I could. So if you ever elect me to the US Senate, maybe I'll get to do that. But for now, I'll yield the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. Catherine, no, Mike is not moving to Ohio, but I can see why you might suggest that. Let's see. Savina, are you here, and would you like to speak to the issue you raised? Savina, you said we also need support on passing the bill 3515 to give access to unhoused youth and adults experiencing homelessness. Savina,
Thank you, thank you so much, Rosemary, and thank you, Mike. I'm pretty sure that you are aware that that is part of our Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign agenda this year, is to really push that act forward and to be visible up at the State House, knocking on the new governor, Maura Healey's door. And more to come on that as we continue to meet and organize.
thank you. Thanks, Savina. Here's an interesting question from Bruce Murray. What social infrastructure achievements can we expect from the 17 states with Democratic trifectas, the governor and both legislative chambers, such as Massachusetts? Do you have a thought about what can be accomplished, Mike?
You know, it's hard to predict exactly, other than, you know, I think one way I would answer this is, I think it's important for us not to just get focused on individual legislative tactics or individual policy tactics, and to continually come back to sort of conceptual understandings and visions. And so to explain what I mean by that, there's many fabulous advocates advocating for many fabulous things in the world of housing policy, and often it's coalitions build around one individual idea: rent control, right to counsel, zoning reform, on homelessness issues, of course. And I think we really need to, and I'm doing this work regularly, I think we really need to bring all of our advocacy together and collectively put forward a real universal vision, and that speaks to all different constituencies, including homeowners, if for no other reason, just as a practical matter, because 2 out of 3 Massachusetts residents live in an owner-occupied housing unit. And so I think on the one hand, and I'll wrap up my answer here, I think on the one hand, because things are so bad, because as I said earlier, we're in this moment where there's no historic precedent for how severe the housing emergency is. It's the worst it's ever been in the year 2023. I do think we have real potential to go real far with transformational policies, but we know that the bankers and the real estate industry are already gearing up to divide us, to divide homeowner against renter, to divide, cities against suburban and rural communities. And so as I'm working with others to portray a vision for housing for all, I think we really have to think about how do we offer things to the 99% of us. And if we do that, then I think we can make these democratic trifectas actually work for all of us.
Great, thank you. I think we have a minute to give a short answer to this one. Cheryl Hogan says, Mike, you mentioned the dollars in federal budget for housing, but how is that money being spent since I don't see investment in public housing?
Oh, great question, because I had another bullet point I skipped over. And let's think about this. The federal home mortgage deduction cost the federal government $216 billion a year, or over 5 years. And the low income housing tax credit, which in itself isn't all that efficient, right? Social housing would be a more efficient way to produce truly affordable housing, not tax credits. But nevertheless, the tax benefits we give to homeowners are 5 to 6 times greater than the tax benefits we are offering to try to produce affordable housing. So, there's sort of multiple levels of, inequity here. There's the giant inequity of a housing budget that is constrained because of our commitment to the military. And then within that budget, there's the inequity of most of that spending going to generally more privileged folks, people who own their own home. So hopefully that helps answer it.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Next, Jonathan.
Right. Our next speaker,
Right.
Jonathan King, who's going to talk to us about weapons budgets undermined, how weapons budgets undermine the pandemic response. And Jonathan is a professor of biology emeritus at MIT and board co-chair with us at Mass Peace Action, as well as a founder of the Fund Healthcare and Not Warfare Working Group of Mass Peace Action, and an organizer of this conference this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosemary. I'm going to follow up on the excellent analysis of Deborah Berger. I'm going to just focus in on one particular piece of it. As someone who spent their life in biomedical research, a piece of it has been always particularly disturbing to me. It wasn't easy to understand how in one of the richest and scientifically most advanced nations in the country, in the world, the country was totally unprepared to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Wait a minute, I need to put on my slides. Just a second. There we go. Part of it has to do with this dysfunctional healthcare system where Medicare, Medicaid, private health insurance, hospital budgets provide coverage for those who are already ill, once you got sick. However, diagnosis, prevention, understanding the mechanism of disease, development of vaccines, therapies, these all depend on biomedical research, which is not covered by Medicare or Medicaid or hospitals. It's funded by federal agencies, the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Center for Disease Control, which are kind of outside the healthcare system. So the vaccine, the knowledge you need for vaccine development, right? That's carried on mostly in research universities and medical schools, and it's funded by mostly the National Institutes of Health here in Massachusetts. Last year, we received kind of more than almost $3 billion in research funds. What does that money do? It pays for the graduate students that are eating pizza around you. It provides the overhead to the institutions to pay for the plumbers, the electricians, the carpenters that keep the lab going, local lab supply and pharmaceutical industry, and the staffing of biotech and pharmaceutical industries. It's very important. It's kind of politically invisible. The money doesn't go through the state legislature. Money doesn't come through the congressional delegation. It comes directly to research groups all around the state. But this is actually key. Now, as people have mentioned, here's the congressional discretionary budget 2017. We're coming into the pandemic period already. And for years before that, more than half the total budget had gone to the military. Now look at this slice up here. The National Institutes of Health, responsible for research on all the ills that afflict the nation's people: heart disease, cancer, stroke, arthritis, diabetes, Alzheimer's, infectious disease, viral infections, fungal infections. They were getting 3% of the federal budget. When you realize that by a few years later, 1 million Americans had died from COVID, you realize how totally inadequate that number is, to have 3% of the federal budget to focused on preventing new diseases and developing therapies and vaccines. So I go around and I give talks about this, often at universities. Often there are occasionally members of the local economics department or political science department. And when I talk about that one side of the budget is starved by the military, they say, oh, no. The Pentagon budget is separate from the civilian budget. Those are separate. So here's President Trump. I'm just going to read you the second paragraph. Budget Director Mulvaney was quite clear in speaking with Republican governors by way of defending the extensive cuts that was in the civilian budget, NIH, Meals on Wheels, VA, etc. Mr. Mulvaney said simply that the White House's priority was military spending and that other reductions were necessary to advance that goal. It's very clear: cut the civilian budget and put the money in and give the money to Lockheed Martin and Boeing and General Dynamics, etc. Now, the consequences were very direct. So Obama in 2016 had organized in the White House, high level, a pandemic response office dealing with things like the Ebola outbreaks and yellow fever. And Trump came in and he closed the pandemic office in 2018. Now, we had two canaries in the coal mine. The SARS outbreak, severe acute respiratory syndrome, 2003 in Hong Kong. That was a coronavirus, a cousin of COVID-19. And some years later, MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, that was an outbreak in the Middle East. So everything was in place to realize, we have these new epidemics. They're a sign of things to come. Let's make sure we can make vaccines against these agents before it has spread at the worldwide level. No, those budgets were cut and the projects were terminated. Now, I mean, once hundreds of thousands of people and the whole economy was coming home by coronavirus, the Congress did act. They passed the CARES Act, which put some more money into the NIH and CDC and vaccine development, and they Project Warp Speed, which paid companies like Moderna and Pfizer directly to make sure that their profitability would be secured if they sped up vaccine development. But those bills, like the CARES bill, that was a one-time injection into the economy. The NIH budget is it's now about 50 billion, 4 or 5% of the total budget, completely inadequate. It ought to be double that. 3 million people suffer from Alzheimer's, cosmetic costs, Medicaid, $250 billion a year to take care of those people, and we're spending $1 billion on it. It's totally out of whack. So the situation actually continues. Now, Bill Hartung noted that the current proposal to upgrade on nuclear weapons, this is Congressional Budget Office estimate, just for 9 years, 2021, 2030, they estimate $634 billion. As he pointed out, the full program, the estimate is $2 trillion over the full 25 years, and keeping these weapons around forever. Now, to bring this alive, the US has 14 Ohio-class submarines. Some of them are always being maintained, but some are out in the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and they all have 24 Trident D5 missiles, and each of those missiles can be fit with multiple targeted warhead. So one submarine can launch hundreds of missiles, each one of which is 10 to 20 times or 50 times more powerful than a bomb dropped at Hiroshima, enough to wipe out every city in Russia, every city in India, every city in China. We have 14 of these.
Jonathan, 1 minute.
Okay, so let me just close with the fact that our government is proposing to buy a dozen more. If you only bought a half a dozen, you could use that as savings, and you could double the budget of the National Institutes of Health. So, it has to be these nuclear weapons. As I sometimes tell my kids, it is the biggest boondoggle in human history. You can't use them. They don't get you to work. They don't keep you healthy. You can't use them to develop other technologies. They just put the whole planet in danger. And it's to ensure that a very small sector of the American economy is insulated from the difficulties of the capitalist economy. They have guaranteed profits. But they buy their way in with our tax dollars. It's a great scam. And as Bill pointed out, it's a handful of large corporations that are making the money, right? We're not threatened. We're not in danger of being invaded by the Russians or invaded by the Chinese or invaded by the North Koreans. We're being threatened by the coronavirus, and all the nuclear weapons in the world, no matter how sophisticated, how accurate, can't protect us from the coronavirus. That requires, a shift from military to civilian spending. So Mike has mentioned some. We'll hear from Rep. McGovern and also from Cole Harrison about initiatives in the U.S. Congress. But I personally think that given the logjam in the U.S. Congress, these state initiatives have real potential. And we have a history, because we know that when Massachusetts first passed divestment from tobacco, and they were the first state, then subsequently other states followed. So both divestment of nuclear weapons and then the taxpayers' right to know bill, which simply informs the taxpayers how the government actually spends their money. Radical piece of information and other stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. One quick question before we go to our break. From Mary Ellen Kirkoulos, I suspect a good deal of biochemical research has shifted to the Pentagon. Is this true? And if so, how much? And what about research into nanotechnology? Okay, so it's more sophisticated than that. The military biomedical research is done under Homeland Security. And so
billions of dollars go into Homeland Security called biological defense. It's really biological weapons research, but they cloak it as a kind of public health initiatives. It's very hard to get at because of national security. Same with the nuclear weapons. Right now, you can't examine what they're actually doing because of national security. So it's not that the Pentagon is doing a lot of biomedical research, it's that Homeland Security is financing it all around the country, and they're making it, I forget who talked about the money used for think tanks. So one of the things they do with that money is they silence public health advocates who otherwise would be speaking out on these things.
Mhm. Thank you, Jonathan. So now,
I do want to say that getting people into the breakouts, it's always scary. Some of you have never done it before. It's more important than me answering more questions. So let's move on to that.
we're going to take a break now. Am I right?
Well, before the break, maybe Cole could describe what's going to happen after the break.
Yeah, so let you take your slides down, Jonathan, but
Stop share. There we go.
yeah, so we have a couple of quick videos. As we enter our break, we're going to, we have 8 breakouts. Most people signed up for their breakout when they registered, but some did not. Plus those who registered in the last couple of hours, we don't have that recorded. But the system will invite you to join your breakout if you've pre-signed up for one. In most cases, you can change your mind. You can leave one breakout and go into another one. You do have to confirm on your computer when it invites you to enter your breakout. If you're on a phone or a tablet, that appears different, but there is a way to do it. For those who don't go into the breakout, so when I open the breakout rooms, most people will go in their breakout pretty soon. Those who can't get into their breakout will remain in this room, and Brian, Kate, and I will help you individually to get into your desired room. The actual breakouts are supposed to come to order at 3:05, which is in 8 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and play a couple of quick videos, and then I'll open the rooms.
Great. Take a break, everybody.
Oh, first I have to do it right. All right.
I want to talk to you about 3
Stop. Just give me 5 seconds and I guarantee you will be shocked. Okay, so I will just
Treaty says no bombs, you can't make them. Own them, buy them, sell them, take them. You can't test them, threaten with or move them. If you got the weapons, you better just lose them. The nuclear ban is coming for you. Treaty bans manufacture, stockpile, acquisition, production, deployment, no matter what the mission. Futures on the phone, got something to say. Lose the nuclear weapons, get them out of the way. Someone get the children, the papas and the moms. Got a little news about the big bad nuke bombs. You forgot about them, think they went away. No way, still here, kill us all in a day. 1,500 across the states, building new nukes in a new arms race. Hey, Uncle Sam, we got news for you. The world got a nuke ban and voted it through. Don't need a preacher man to know the right thing to do. Necessary evil, the politicians say. Well, the old men, hair all gone, all gray. Total annihilation, just the price you pay. We want a future, now get the hell out of the way. The nuclear ban is coming for you. Missile silos, Midwest, wanna test, not best. All the rest, bombs and jets, what a mess. Payload of catastrophe, flying over you and me. Apocalypse, insanity, that ain't how it ought to be. Oh, India's got 'em, so does Pakistan, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Uncle Sam. Nuclear Korea, not to mention Israel, dirty little secret. Hush, hush, don't tell. Nuclear ban is coming for you. 9 nations think it's swell to send the world straight to hell. Other countries don't agree with wiping out humanity. Turn to smoke and ashes, everything we can see. Our kind says this isn't how it has to be.
Okay, so I'm going to open the rooms. The trick is accept your invitation to your room if it's the right one. You can change your mind and go into another room, or if it doesn't invite you to any one room, but just invites you to pick a room. Now for breakout chairs and recorders and panelists, I have endeavored to make as many of you as possible co-hosts so that you can record your video and so that you can share your slides. For those that I missed, you're going to have, if you need one of those privileges, you're going to have to come back to the main room, because I can only give you the privilege in the main room. I can't do it in the breakout room. Okay, good luck. So go ahead and accept the invitation to your breakout room now, if you can see that question on your screen. Okay, if you are still here, that means you haven't joined a room yet. Please, you can put into the chat the room that you want to join, and we will try to put you in there.
Well, it looks like we got most people in cold. Do you want me to, I'm going to unmute a couple of the people who look like they're having trouble, or ask you to unmute, and then we can communicate directly. Eddie McGregor?
Eddie is my last name.
For Eddie.
Yes.
Which room are you trying to get into?
Anything dealing with the TPNW, or I thought I'd picked one on the form. I guess I messed up. Just put me in one that you think is good. Nuclear weapons.
Fair enough.
Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah, Cole on the side asked me to be the recorder for the session I'm also speaking in, and I got sent to the wrong room. I should be in F, promoting nuclear disarmament in the Congressional Progressive Caucus and progressive organizations.
Okay, let's get you where you need to be.
Hello, this is Doug. I'm just on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Could you put me in C, cutting budgets for nuclear weapons? Thank you.
I think we can do that.
Hi, can you hear me?
We do hear you.
Okay, Jake is my name, calling from Chicago. Thank you for finally answering. Put me in TPNW or cutting budgets for nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
This is Gwen. If you can put me with Jackie Cabalsi, just was in the progressive caucus, how to get them to, I guess that's the same thing, cut budgets.
Gotcha.
Hi, Alfred. Nice to see you.
Hi, Gwen. I'd like to go to cutting budgets too, please.
Uh-huh.
Number C. Thank you.
Right. Number
I
C.
put in the chat promoting ND, Robert Reed, into promoting nuclear, promoting ND.
Oh, do you know which one that is offhand? I think several of these could be described as promoting nuclear disarmament, if not all of them.
RR in the chat promoting disarmament.
It's the CPC is promoting nuclear disarmament. It got a really long to be shortened.
Got it. That's why I'm confused. We'll send you over there, Robert.
And mayors that'd like to be in cutting nuclear budgets.
Mm-hmm. Done and done. Let's see. How about you, Cheryl? Are you looking at?
Yes, please. May I be moved over to the not militarizing the war with China? Not, I think it's number 2.
That's back from the brink. You must be resisting a new Cold War with China. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. How about HPJC?
Would you move me over to that same one on China?
I think we can. Yep. Okay. Resisting Cold War. Yep. So you just need to accept the prompt. There you go. I see Romy. Oh, you're muted, so you just need to, a thing popped up on your screen that said, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, could you put up a list? I don't know what rooms are there.
Yeah, sure. Let me share my screen really quick.
Thank you.
And I just put a list in the chat.
Oh, that's probably even easier. Yeah, let me not muddy the waters here. If there's a list in the chat. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, I'd like, please, to be in the one about China.
Okay.
Thank you.
There you go. Enjoy. And everybody else has to, so maybe they're just taking breaks.
Yeah, it could be.
But they do have the ability to unmute if they need to, right?
Yes.
Yeah, China is not my enemy.